my AlanTuring hat on. I've been leading a number of projects in environment sustainability, including the ASG program, which many of you might have heard about. My day job is Exec Dean of Engineering, Maths and Physical Sciences at Royal Holloway.
Thanks. So I'm Blair Edwards. I was speaking earlier. I'm a senior researcher at IBM. I've been with IBM Research for about 8 years now, and as I said before, kind of came in as a data scientist, then specialised in geospatial data, and now have had a big focus around kind of climate sustainability applications. I lead one of the leads for the development of kind of geospatial data and modelling tools and technologies within research.
Wonderful. So we have 4 very constrained questions, obviously. I suggest we go through them linearly. So the first question I'd like your feedback on is, what are the upcoming trends in data science that could be pivotal in tackling environmental issues, do you think? Who would like to go first?
I seem to be given too much.
I'm just going to let it organically manage itself.
Yeah, I'll drop mine. I think, well, to my mind, one of the things that is going to be increasingly important is, we've talked about it today, or other people talked very eloquently, about actually joining data and models together. So environmental models with demographic models, with health data sets, with infrastructure building. And I think that's something that both has a kind of scientific challenge in how do we actually flow information through, carry uncertainty, what kind of metrics do we need if we're looking at the health effects of climate, for example, if we take climate projections, how do we link those, which are essentially numerical outputs on cells, to individual people or populations or different population groups. If we think about flooding, there were some examples earlier, going through hydrological models, which are computationally very expensive. Can we use data science emulation, for example, to speed up that computation? So I think there are lots of kind of data science environmental challenges. The thing I think that has been overlooked until relatively recently, and plug for Digital Solutions Hub here, is that kind of workflow and data flow pipeline. So how do you actually make something that in a robust sends that data and those models together? We talked about joining models earlier and data. And increasingly, and I know this was in one of the presentations, and I apologise, I can't remember which one it was, we are increasingly using data for reasons it wasn't originally recorded. And I think increasingly, sorry, I'm bleeding into other questions. We do really need to kind of acknowledge that, understand the data journey, data collection mechanisms, how different types of data collected very differently can, should, or shouldn't be joined together, and make sure that this is well documented, all the boring stuff. And I think one of the questions earlier on was, who's going to pay for the kind of, to keep the infrastructure there, the non-sexy things. But I think increasingly there's recognition, at least in forums like this, that that is very, very important, and someone does need to.
Great. What else?
I didn't think I'd really have an answer to this question, so I'm a total interloper here. I'm not a data scientist or very technical in any way, but actually just hearing you talk made me think very much one of the sort of key focuses that we have both at Open Data Manchester and Disposal is around creating open standards for data. And I think it's that sort of boring underlying infrastructure stuff that isn't the shiny, sexy stuff that gets funded, but is so incredibly important to enable the shiny, sexy stuff to happen. And excitingly, I think that some people, some organisations, funders are starting to see that that is actually really important. And we've just recently been funded to develop an open standard for packaging data. I know, how exciting. But it is actually really useful because packaging is a pretty big problem from an environmental point of view. Not as big as many other problems, but actually having a kind of a standardised picture of what we're talking about and who's got it and what they're doing with it and what might happen to it once we bin it is incredibly important. And I think without standards, it's really hard to do that kind of baseline work and then actually monitor whether you're making progress or not. So I'm excited to see that. I think maybe ever so slightly and slowly people are starting to see that kind of foundation and infrastructure is really important. So that's good, I think.
So I was going to pick up, and I totally agree with what you guys have said. I think, interoperability is super important for data and models, and of course standards is an important part of that. And I think that can really be transformational, because I think, as you said, right, this enables people with different sets of expertise, right, to actually work together in a coherent way, right? So these challenges that we're trying to address are really, really big, right? There's not one scientist who can do all of that stuff, right? It needs to be a pipeline of work. It needs to be a climate scientist developing and running climate models, a hydrologist then using that to drive flood models, for example, then, I don't know, an urban planner or somebody running infrastructure or like building models to look at damage, and then you need, I don't know, an economist or a societal, like a social scientist to look at what's the actual then real damage, either financially or societally. And so we need ways to kind of streamline that, because I think traditionally that was incredibly hard, right? That it either didn't happen, or it would be like one person would do one bit and publish a paper, and then the next person would maybe try and grab that thing and run it, but maybe they wouldn't get it right, or it'd take up a long time. And we should be able to create these collaborations and streamline all these processes, right? And that's kind of something we've had in our mind trying to develop a lot of these tools, is how do we help that interoperability between all the different stakeholders in these things, right? So I think interoperability and communication, like in an interdisciplinary way, is going to be really kind of transformational.
I think the rest of the panel have covered that question.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I mean, I think it's safe to say that it's in some ways upcoming trends include a robust reflection on infrastructural needs that matter, to take some of these technologies forward. So related to that, the second question: how can data scientists work effectively with environmental scientists, policymakers, and other stakeholders?
So I've got the mic, and I feel I'm obliged to answer this now. Right. So I think it's really interesting looking at the people who are in this room. Okay, particularly people who are earlier career, people who kind of are interested in this kind of interdisciplinary research, because one of the things that is going to be absolutely key when you're kind of talking about collaborations, I think Blair just talked really, really well there in terms of, the importance of making sure that we have different disciplines represented, because we need to make sure the expertise is in the right place. Because one of the great things about AI, something like ChatGPT, is that anyone can use it to do stuff, right? And then we want to be confident as scientists that what we're doing is actually sensible. And so I think that having that expertise is really key, but also working across different areas and thinking about, it's very, very difficult to have an effective collaboration where people don't at least share some language and some understanding. So it's keeping that open mind and being willing to understand, firstly, a little bit about other areas of scientific research, but also about things like policy and so on as well. So if we want our work to make a difference, we have to be engaging with that as well, and sort of making sure that we're able to convey the messages that we think are really important.
I guess I would just say that I think it's important that when you build projects and collaborations, especially if they're of any reasonable size, right, you need to make sure you try and capture all these different stakeholders, right? An example from a few years back, we had a UKRI funded project around agritech, and it was the collaboration that we built was IBM as the technology partner, but then we had academic groups, kind of from the science side. We had small agronomic businesses who had an insight into actually how that ran, but then we also picked people who had relationships even with the farmers, right? And we would have workshops with farmers. We would have that kind of constant dialogue. So what we were doing wasn't like siloed, right? We weren't just coming at this from like, what can we do with data and AI that's cool, right? We were coming at it from like, what do these people actually need, right? So sometimes it's a way of thinking and approaching these problems, I think.
Yeah, I think that To me, a lot of it is about communication and generally being interested in, well, what other people's jobs are and what they're doing. So communication, I think, is very important. We've seen some fantastic examples today that however technical the things we're doing are, and we are in a room, by the way, we've just described data and modelling as the sexy bit. However exciting that is, we do need to be able to communicate it at varying levels of technical to different audiences. So if you're talking to a CEO or a government policy maker who don't have very much time and they really want to know what can be done and what decisions they can make, that's very different than if you're talking to a researcher who, as Blair said, is going to want to take your model and run it. So I think the ability to kind of work at those different technical levels. The other, I think, is to really get an understanding of what people need. So if we think about policymakers, an example, we were part of a group set up by the WHO to do a global model for air quality, where there are lots of ways of getting global maps of air quality. This was specifically to do health impact analysis, and so there was kind of constraints on what was needed in order to go into the next part of the process. And it was really interesting to be part of a project where the kind of driver was from the end and the beginning, because we had to build a model taking in ground monitoring, satellites, land use, etc., which was the kind of technical bit, but we always knew where the end point had to be. Now, actually, because we did an awful lot of working across a very interdisciplinary group, the end point did change slightly because there was a good reason for it to change, based on the fact that we were able to model in a better way than I think was anticipated at the beginning. So I think it's that interdisciplinary kind of connections, the kind of networks that we're building today here in this room, and also that kind of desire to want to know how your work is going to be used, and to not just think my job is to get it to this point and then hand it over, to make sure it's sticky and you go with it a little.
Yeah, I think everyone's actually said pretty much everything I was going to say, but just to reiterate a point, I suppose, to really talk to people, and especially if you're doing research on a subject or on an area, like you were talking about talking to the farmers and things. I think that's so crucial, and it can be so easily overlooked. And it's a difficult bit, and it can be time-consuming, but it also, I think, can be incredibly rewarding, and I think will be much more likely to mean that whatever your outputs are, they're going to actually have impact in the world and be real and useful to people. So I think don't be afraid to go and talk to people, and probably will change what you're thinking or what you are aiming for. But I don't think that's a bad thing.
Okay. Well, left a little bit of time for the third one because I think it's probably of most interest to a lot of people here. So we have got facilities such as ChatGPT, and they're clearly here to stay in various different flavours. Ignoring the Dallas type drama that occurred over the weekend. But do you think this is a good or a bad thing for environmental science? There's various layers to this, I think, totally.
So I guess the first thing I think about is, is environmental science, and I'm not an environmental scientist, by the way, so is it different to other science? So I'm gonna look at colleagues who I know work in this area. It is, Dave, as you say, it is here to stay, right? And the good thing is that the increased accessibility, right, to tools and techniques. Okay, so people have an increased ability to interrogate things, for example, that they didn't before. So this is a positive thing. Obviously, the flip side of that is that the more complexity we have, and the less kind of visibility of the way that methods are working, the greater the chance that people are not going to spot when the information is inaccurate. So I think that applies across the board, but I will defer to a colleague who might comment from an environmental perspective.
Well, I'm going to start off very positive, which is different than my day job, which is largely thinking about how ChatGPT works with university assessments. I think, well, actually, I'm going to borrow from a conversation that Dave and Richard and some others had at the Turing earlier this week with Alan. One thing you could imagine is interrogating very large environmental data sets. If we think about climate projections, we often joke how many PhDs in data science does it take to actually process and get out the answer. Well, at the Turing, the answer is about 5 or 6, because that's how many people are trying to do it at the moment. But imagine you could just type in a question. You know, I'm interested in, I almost said Liverpool, that's probably really bad, isn't it? I'm interested in Manchester in the future, in 20 decades, how many weeks in a row do we think it's going to be above 35 degrees? And that at the moment would require quite a lot of processing, ignoring the complexities that there'll be different runs and things. And then you could add to that query, in an ideal world, and how many schools are capable of operating between the hours of 3 and 5. So you could actually democratize quite a lot of data. But to Caroline's point, that's the positive, is of course that's only really, those answers are going to be built on the data sets that put into them, and there will be a lot of nuances and complexities that may well get ignored. So we still are going to need people who understand not so much how ChatGPT and LLMs, generative models work technically, but actually when they can be trusted, when they can't be trusted. And also then that next step, similar to what we said to the others, is how do you communicate that? Do you just take the answer that appears on screen, write it down and give it to someone and say there's the answer? Or do you kind of explain the background and your confidence in that? Also, if you knew which data sets were going into it, you're not going to because it will trawl everything. And if you knew any data sets were not included, maybe proprietary ones that aren't available on the good old World Wide Web, would your answer change? And I think that's where the kind of interpretation is going to start to be much more important. So generating answers and generating data and writing some code to do something is going to be much, much quicker, and lots of people will be able to do it who can't do it today. But I think we do need to make sure that we kind of keep rooted in reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo what both of you said, right? I think the potential in this area is massive, right? It can be really, really transformational in the way that it can democratize access to information for people. It can accelerate the research. ChatGPT is probably not the thing to do that, right? ChatGPT is not that good, right? It's fine for some stuff. It's not that good if you really want to understand like real trusted answers for things. So I'd say caution with ChatGPT. But the technology behind it, right, is really powerful. And as you said, if we can have trusted models where we know what data's gone into them, potentially we've tuned them to have that understanding and context around particular domains, right? So can we take something like ChatGPT or BERT or one of these other big language models and then give it a bit of extra training to bring in the context of climate, environment, that sort of thing, sustainability. I think they can be really, really powerful. But yeah, the caveat is, of course, you have to have that trust and the kind of governance around that. And I know IBM and lots of other companies and organizations are really thinking really hard about that and are trying to put that in place, right? Because not even from a climate and environment point of view, right? Businesses, if they want to start using this technology, they don't want to start using random models where they don't know what's gone into it, right? So I think the same thing applies here. For science, it's even more important.
So that teased me up nicely, although I'm going to just do a slight detour into just a silly anecdote about ChatGPT, which is that, I mean, I think it has real potential for freeing up time where you are doing really tedious things that actually it can help you do quicker. And as having the kind of job I have, sometimes you have to write bios for yourself and things like that, and that can be quite painful, writing nice things about yourself. And Julian, our CEO at Open Data Manchester, is particularly terrible at doing that for himself, and so he was like, oh, I'm going to use that, see what it comes up with. And honestly, it came up with the most incredible bio for him, spot on, super, apart from when it got to the point in 2018 when it said, unfortunately, Julian passed away in 2018, much to the open data community's dismay and, an outpouring of love. But yeah, so do check that it is accurate. I wonder what happened in 2018 that made it think he'd died. Anyway, so that was just a funny aside. I think the bit I was going to come back on is around governance, and I haven't totally followed what's been going on with OpenAI over the weekend because I've been very busy, but I think that to me, it's really alarming. I think there's something incredibly important about having governance structures in place that safeguard how these things are used and ensure that, you know, the data and the models that go into feeding them are representative and not full of terrible biases. And actually, I think that, you know, as much thought probably needs to be going into how we make these things safe for people and for the environment in that kind of governance perspective. And I think that it's often something that's tacked on at the end, or it's kind of thought about afterwards. And I think many more things probably should be trying to embed that right at the start and making sure that if they're designing things like that, that it's done well. And I think what's alarming to me about the OpenAI thing is that it sounds to me like they tried to do that and yet it has managed to be completely overturned. But I'm not an expert on it, so.
So I completely agree, Sophie, completely agree. And I think this is really important because, again, without, obviously, I guess none of us know fully what's happened, but we have ideas. So you cannot rely on commerce to regulate itself in that way because they're interested in making as much money as possible, and that's it really. And then, you know, people may try to put guardrails around that, but still. And so I think it's up to us, isn't it, right? So we can't do everything, but we can think as a scientific community about, you know, what it is that we want from these kinds of technologies, the ways in which we're prepared to use them. So it's up to us to set the standards in a way.
Can I just... yeah, just to follow on from that, I think we need to be careful as well that we don't kind of introduce more inequality. So ChatGPT 3.5 is free, but 4 is expensive. If we have two different versions of an LLM and one has up-to-date data and costs some money and the other one doesn't and is a few years out of date, then we are potentially going to make inequalities in decision making. And of course, when we're making decisions about the environment, sustainability, people's health, infrastructure, buildings and things, we are liable to then kind of make those inequalities greater. And I think, to my mind, data science and AI should be doing exactly the opposite, but I think there's every chance, if not regulated, that it will do that. But Caroline's right, you know, we are a community of scientists. Why aren't we building our own Enviro ChatGPT, probably because it's trademarked, where actually we do build and we know the data that goes into, we trust the data, it's UKCP 18, it's other things that we kind of understand, and actually we do build our own kind of LLMs and generative models that then, well, similarly to foundation models that can be generalized, but there is a group of people actually who can answer to the kind of the inputs at least.
I was just going to say one more thing, which is not the same as what we've talked about here, but related to these kind of large AI models, which is just something to think about really, is that they give us lots of massive benefits, but they also take a lot of energy to train them, right? So there are other implications, right? We get all these benefits, they're really cool, but we also, at some point, need to be thinking about what is the footprint of training these models, of using these models. And that's something that lots of people are also thinking about, right? Building more lightweight models or building more efficient infrastructure to train them and different things like that, but it's just another thing to think about.
So just to add on to this conversation, that was really fascinating because it makes you think about, you know, the next generation of emerging scientists. Do they have to understand all of this, or is there a role? Do we keep people in siloed areas? I mean, this goes back to that second point. Right?
So I think I was going to say, I think there's a level of understanding that people need to have, right? So people need to understand at a high level, like, where this stuff's coming from, when you should and shouldn't trust it, and things like that. People don't need to understand all the details, right? But you need to understand kind of what the potential risks and benefits are.
I think just to add to that, I think that then, you know, going back to what we were talking about earlier, interdisciplinary teams and things like that, I think are incredibly important in this. Because yeah, you don't need to be the expert on all of that stuff, but if you've got people around you that you can, you know, call on and that you can question and you can explore things together, I think you're going to be able to address all those things without having to be some sort of super oracle person that knows absolutely everything, which I think is impossible. You know, that's just not going to happen. And I think that it's actually a really great opportunity in which to facilitate more working with other people and bringing those kind of different perspectives together. And so hopefully that's what it will do, rather than people kind of, get more siloed and think, oh, that's the whole load of extra stuff I can't be bothered to think about. Hopefully they'll realise that the only way to make these things stick, I think, is to try and make them work on all of those parameters. And, as you were saying earlier, these are hugely complex, massive systemic problems. You aren't going to fix it by only looking at one bit. So you kind of have to take that systems approach, I think.
Okay, well, so I thought we'd end on somewhat tangential, but I think relevant to the audience here. So given the role you now have, what advice would you give to your younger self?
I go to the pub more, which everybody knows me would be struggle with. What I really mean by this is I would go to more events like this, and I'd actually talk to more people. And I think one of the things that I belatedly realised is actually meeting people, building a network is not just useful for your career and things, but actually it's where real kind of new ideas spark. And especially when we're talking about these large societal problems, how to deal with climate change, net zero, how do we improve people's health, reduce inequalities. There is not one person, well, there probably are some oracles who think they can do it on their own, but they probably have learned the whole internet as well. But then by meeting different people in different disciplines, you can start to see how your work might fit into something bigger, but also, also meeting people doing very similar things to you who, well, my PhD was full of stalls and frustration, so actually to meet people who've been through those and solved those problems or looked at it a different way was remarkably useful. You can do that in a pub as well, by the way. But I think I would be signing up to as many of these type of events as humanly possible, and then explaining to my supervisor or my line manager why I haven't really done any real work. But I have.
I don't mind going next. I found this hard to think about, actually. I think mostly because what I'd say is you have absolutely zero idea where you're going to end up, and that's okay. And actually just be curious and be open to opportunity and say yes to stuff. Yeah, I mean, I would never have imagined that this is what I'd be doing, but I really love it and I'm really lucky. And I think it's amazing what kind of is presented to you if you're kind of open to it and willing to take a risk. And I think I'm very lucky that I'm able to take risks, and I totally understand that there's a lot of privilege around that. But I think, yeah, just you can often have this idea around where you think you're going to end up and what you're going to do, and what you're going to be when you grow up. And from my experience, that is absolutely not what's happened at all. And from very, very, very few people I know have ended up doing what they thought they were going to do, and I think that's fine. And so kind of don't stress too much. And I think, I don't know, the things that I value the most in my team, I suppose, so in terms of thinking about what qualities are useful or what maybe you should kind of focus on, I would say caring about what you do and like being interested in it and being curious and being willing to give it a try. And I think if you can do those things, you'll probably do fine in whatever random door you open and go through. Probably terrible career advice.
That's good to know. So, when I was younger, I was really aware that I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, I still have that awareness today, and which I think is good. But also, I think the other thing though, and I think it's really key for younger researchers who have a really fresh perspective on stuff, don't assume that other people know what they're doing either, because they don't. Particularly, older, established people. Right. So what they're doing at the moment might be fine, right? But actually, science is like learning that we were wrong before. Okay, that's the thing about it. And so I'm particularly thinking about Blair's comment about things like the lack of environmental sustainability that's been given up to now. Things are starting to change, but very, very little consideration. Right? We've just gone, bigger computers, and that's what we do. And then a few people, and they are often younger people, starting to step back and go, hang on, maybe this is an issue, particularly if we're doing this environmental science, shouldn't we be thinking about it? Anyway, so I would really, that's one example, but I would really advise you to always be thinking around things. what are those other, either your peers or those older scientists, what are they not, you're going, but this thing, but this thing. And yeah, go with it, right? Because that's, how we make progress.
And nobody knows what they're doing. That's a secret, honestly. No one knows what they're doing. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just, I definitely don't know what I'm doing. And yeah, I was going to say, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with my career. So we'll see where that goes, I guess. But yeah, I think what these guys have said is all really good advice. Like, be open to talk to people and listen to what they have to say. Both within your particular area, but then also more broadly. Be open to new opportunities. Always be like thinking about different ways of doing things. Try and be, it's often hard, I find it really hard to be creative, but think about like different ways of doing things, and a lot of that comes from communication, hearing different points of view. And then, yeah, just be open to opportunities, right? And don't close yourself off. I used to, before I joined IBM, I was an experimental astrophysicist, doing dark matter searches, going down mines, and I totally changed and started doing data science, and now I'm doing AI and climate sustainability, and I don't know what I'll be doing in 5 years' time, but I'm sure it'll be interesting.
Wonderful, great. I still think there's a chance I'll be accepted into the 80, but that's for another. Right, okay. So that was a really interesting discussion. So thanks for the panel. And that's it. I'd just like to say it's been a wonderfully interesting day. So many diverse activities across the community. It's great to see. We'd love to hold more regular events like this, certainly every year. If you do have a feel for what you would like to see at these type of events, let us know. As the panel have said, you're here to shape things. So get in touch and tell us what you think you would like from this. But thanks again, and safe journey home, and see you soon.